Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you everyone for being here today. With the indulgence of the audience, I'd like to begin my presentation this afternoon with the personal account of the road I travelled to be here with you today. In some ways, it's a personal story, but in other ways, it's more than a personal story, it's a shared story, and I hope the things I say now will resonate with other people in the audience. In 2005, I attended a modest yet well-organised and exciting conference at the University of Western Australia. It was focused on non-human animals. I learnt of the conference only after the call for papers had closed. Nonetheless, at considerable expense, I travelled to Perth and I participated in the conference because as a PhD student and aspiring academic interested in non-human animals, I'd been searching for opportunities to discuss my research with like-minded scholars. I'm very glad I attended that conference. It was organised by Natalie Edwards and it was the first Australian Animal Studies or AASG conference as we now know them. I, like many people, had a fantastic time at that conference, and there was a small group of people from the University of Tasmania who were also equally invigorated by what happened, and they undertook to hold the second conference in 2 years' time at UTAS. That second conference was organised by Carol Freeman and Yvette Watt and others at UTAS. It was markedly bigger than the first conference, and it was the first opportunity I'd ever had to present my animal-related research to other people interested in the area. Again, it was a wonderful, invigorating experience. At that conference, an energetic man by the name of Rod Bennison said that he'd organise the next AASG conference and that it would be held at Newcastle. The next conference in 2009 was called Minding Animals, and as you no doubt recall, it was rather big. That conference was a wonderful chance for Australian human animal studies scholars to network with other academics from around the world. At that conference, we also formally created the Australian Animal Studies Group, and we began the process of setting up a committee and incorporating. It was my great pleasure to serve on that inaugural committee and to see AASG go from a small group of like-minded colleagues to a properly incorporated entity. The next conference was organised by Leah Burns at Griffith University, and it included all the features we've come to expect from AASG and from human animal studies in this country. It was interdisciplinary, it was international, it included book launches, art exhibitions and space for activists. To my mind, that conference really consolidated the field of human animal studies in Australia. Not only did all the regulars attend, but more and more scholars began to identify human-animal aspects to their research, and they began joining us. More people joined AASG, the organisation, and when we held our AGM, there was no shortage of people eager to put up their hands to sit on the committee. Among the people who joined the committee at that time was Fiona, who of course brought AASG to Sydney. I have been really impressed with the job the AASG committee has been doing, the AASG committee and also Fiona's committee have been doing with organising this conference here, and no doubt this is going to be another outstanding achievement for human animal studies in this country. Now, I've not been invited here in my capacity as the AASG's unofficial historian, but my point in remembering all of this is that I think it's worthwhile taking a moment to reflect on how far we've come. When I applied to undertake my PhD at this very institution, I was advised in writing that the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney could not provide supervision to someone interested in animals, but that if I wished to explore animal-related questions, I should apply to philosophy. At that time, it was only philosophers who were permitted to ask non-invasive questions concerning non-human animals. How things have changed. It is therefore a double pleasure to be invited to address this conference today. It's lovely because I feel that I've been part of a long journey and that I've shared that journey with many other human animal studies scholars in this country and in this room. But it's particularly moving to deliver this at my alma mater, given the institution's initial unwillingness to engage in the question, what is it that we owe non-human animals? So thank you to the conference committee for inviting me to speak, and thank you all very much for being here. It's a very great honour. So while it's undoubtedly true that human animal scholarship has gone from strength to strength, both in Australia and around the world, it's also true that political scientists have been slow to come to the party. Why might that be? The study of politics is the study of power relations in complex societies. Perhaps unsurprisingly, because humans construct political institutions and do so in order to manage our power relations among ourselves, particularly in relation to valued and finite resources, those who study power relations tend to be interested in humans and humans only. Alastair Cochrane from the University of Sheffield argues that the human-non-human relationship provides a perfect lens through which to consider the question of power relations. The reason for that is that the power differential between humans and non-humans is so significant. However, while that's undoubtedly true, in my view, the power difference is so momentous that it might appear to many mainstream political scholars to be an uninteresting case. Yet nonetheless, slowly but surely, we're starting to get a critical mass of political scholars who are interested in animal questions. Robert Garner has been working in this field for a long time. His latest book, A Theory of Justice for Animals, is in my view his best work to date. In it, he provides an account of why it might be said that the distinctly political institution of justice can be applied to non-human animals. Now, this is a big advance on Garner's previous work. Previously, he'd argued that the liberal commitment to moral pluralism means that the justice principle only applies to humans. The reason for this is that traditionally, moral pluralism has been taken to mean that we're all free to pursue our own version of the good life, so long as doing so doesn't harm others, with the word other acting as code for humans only. However, we're quickly moving beyond that assumption, and many people are starting to consider at least some non-human animals to be the type of others worthy of moral consideration. Alastair Cochrane is another political scientist who's weighed into the animal debate. Cochrane's made quite a prolific contribution in the field, and no doubt he's going to continue to do so in the future. More recently, Will Kimlecker has thrown his hat in the ring. Kimlecker is a well-known political philosopher who's most famous for his contribution on multiculturalism. His book Zoopolis was released in 2011, and it's had quite an impact. And of course, my own contribution, which is called Animals, Equality and Democracy. So while these are the leading theorists at the moment, particularly this last author is quite an exceptional leader in the area, more and more journal articles are starting to be published by political scholars trying to make sense of what our political institutions mean to non-human animals. And I know that quite a number of PhD students are also working in the field. Indeed, while we remain a small community of political scholars interested in non-human animals, commentators are starting to identify schools of thought within political scholarship in this field. Those who do so tend to place Garner and Cochrane on one side and Kimlecker and me on the other. According to this analysis, Garner and Cochrane are interested in more universal values that might apply to animals in general, whereas Kimlecker and I are more interested in what we owe to animals by virtue of the fact that some animals have joined us here in contemporary political society. To borrow the language of the contract theorist, in my view, some animals have been contracted in, and it is precisely because they've been contracted in that we owe them some of the benefits that we claim are associated with a life lived within a liberal democracy. What you see on screen now is the reason I'm grouped with Kimlecker and said to be interested in a relational approach to animals and political science. In my view, when we think about non-human animals and their role within liberal democracies, we must first distinguish between those animals that live in the wilderness, beyond human control, and those animals who live among us within political society. While it is true that the political decisions we make will have an impact on the lives of animals living out there in the wilderness beyond political society, not least of all because we continue to alter their habitat, it is equally true that political decisions made in the US will have an impact on us in Australia, but we are not American citizens. Our life chances are not intimately and comprehensively informed by the detail of American statute law. We live apart from the American political system. Likewise, many non-human animals live apart from contemporary political society. Let's call those non-human animals, of which there are many, many billions, some of which are species that we haven't even identified, let's call those animals free-living animals. Free-living animals are not the types of animals that have been contracted into political society. They may well have moral rights, but if they also have political rights, those rights are exclusively negative. They are not right, and in practice, really, they're the right to non-interference. They are not owed positive rights, and I'm not going to consider those animals further in my discussion today. Let's call those animals who've joined us here in modern political society captive animals. Those animals are captive in as much as they've either been bred to live easily among us, or they are literally under human domination, either by means of a cage, tethers, or some other type of dependency relationship. Captive animals are the smaller proportion of non-human animals who live on Earth, but they're by no means insignificant. Many billions of animals are purposely bred and then killed for food every year. Every aspect of their lives, from how they're bred, to where they're housed, to what they're fed, their access to veterinary care, their access to exercise, the manner in which they're transported, and eventually the manner in which they die, is the subject of legislation. In my view, those animals are part of the liberal democratic landscape. The laws we create to regulate their lives are created using all the same mechanisms we use to create other liberal democratic laws. And in my view, there's no reason why those laws should not reflect liberal democratic values, both in the way in which they are formulated and the interest they bestow upon the subjects of that legislation. However, before saying something about what specific liberal democratic values we might harness in order to protect the interests of captive animals, let me say something about how we do in fact currently generate laws to regulate the lives of animals. The first thing I'll say is that the laws we create for non-human animals are terribly inconsistent. They do not protect the interests of all animals under all circumstances. They are discriminatory against certain types of animals, but this is well known. The next thing I'd like to draw to your attention is that the laws regulating the lives of animals are not species specific. They do not deal with animals as members of species groups. Rather, they tend to group animals according to their station in life or functionality. To better illustrate this point, consider a single rabbit. Let's call the rabbit Bugs. Bugs could be a companion animal living in a hatch in someone's backyard. Bugs could be a research animal living in a scientific facility somewhere in a university or elsewhere. Bugs could be a factory farmed animal being raised for fur or meat. Bugs could be an exhibited animal living in a petting zoo, existing so children can have the experience of touching or holding a rabbit. Or bugs could be a free-living animal living according to however he or she wishes to live or is evolved to live in the wilderness. Indeed, a single rabbit could play a range of different roles throughout the course of his or her life. The point I want to make to you is that the physiology of a rabbit never changes. Yet the laws treat rabbits in petting zoos very different to the way they treat rabbits in research laboratories. When it comes to protecting animals from harm, it isn't the species that matters so much, but rather the way in which the individual animal serves humans. This practice of viewing animals through a utility lens is closely equated with the principle of unnecessary suffering. The principle of unnecessary suffering lies at the heart of the contemporary debate over animals and contemporary animal ethics. According to that principle, because animals are sentient, it's wrong to cause them to suffer in ways that are unnecessary. What constitutes necessity or unnecessary suffering is a subject of almost all political contestation over animals. According to most theorists, the concept of unnecessary suffering is closely linked to the value humans derive from causing animals to suffer. We get plenty of economic benefit from exporting animals' life to the Middle East, but we derive none, if any, benefit from allowing dogs to starve to death in people's backyards. We therefore permit the former but prohibit the latter. So on the table on the screen now, you can see the second division I make when I think about animals and their place within liberal democracies is between animals that are economically productive and animals that are not. Now that's where many theorists leave the division. In the minds of some, the big question, or possibly the only question, is, are we trying to make money out of the animal? If the answer is yes, the animal is thought to be vulnerable to poor statutory interest protection and vice versa. However, in my work, I argue that more than just economics is at play when policymakers decide to protect the interests of some animals more comprehensively than others. Economics matters a huge amount, and I don't wish to dispute that. But if economics were the only thing that mattered, we would find that all economically productive animals would receive the same low level of statutory interest protection. That is not the case. There's a marked variation in the level of interest protection enjoyed by different types of economically productive animals. Indeed, my research has led me to conclude that dogs in circuses who are economically productive receive favourable statutory interest protection in the state of New South Wales compared to dogs in somebody's backyard. If economics was the only thing that mattered, that would not be the case. I believe that the extent to which the community is able to see, smell, hear, know and engage with non-human animals is a significant factor that also informs variations in the allocation of statutory interest protection. In order to do my research into this, in order to examine this empirically, I chose 4 case study animals. And I compared the level of statutory protection afforded these 4 species of animals when they're engaged in a range of typical activities. Now, because the law is activity specific, I had to consider the type of legal protection afforded the 4 species of animals when they're engaged in very specific activities. I couldn't do my analysis if I were to think in generalities. So this is an example of the kinds of activities I examined. And across the top, you can see the 4 case study animals that I used. And down the side, those categories equate to the categories in the table I had up on screen earlier. So I had a look at things such as horses used in research, horses used in flat racing, police horses, horses obviously just as people's companions. I had a look at hens raised for meat, that's a broiler hen. I had a look at cockfighting. I had a look at chooks in people's backyards, rabbits used in research. Rabbits raised for their meat and pelt, rabbits used in research, rabbits in petting zoos, dogs in research, dogs in circuses, and also that's a military working dog. So I had a look at assistance dogs, including military working dogs. I then compared the level and type of interest protection afforded those animals when they're engaged in those particular activities with reference to the laws that regulate the lives of non-human animals in New South Wales. What I found is that when non-human animals are engaged in a high visibility activity, they're more likely to receive strong protection against harm, or more likely to receive strong protection against harm than when they're engaged in a low visibility activity. What this tells me is 2 things. First, there is no strong community support for animal suffering. Where the community is exposed to animal suffering, they will invoke the liberal democratic right to ask their elected representatives to act in the interests of the animals. We saw this in the case of live animal exports in this country. The second thing it tells me is that the Liberal democratic promise of transparency in policy formation fails in the case of non-human animals. Better interest protection for high visibility animals compared to weaker protection for low visibility animals suggests that the regulatory system is not meeting its Liberal democratic promise in at least two significant ways. There's a lack of transparency and the community is disengaged from the policy formation process. No doubt, if I were to report to you that I conducted a survey of childcare centres and that childcare centres close to main streets where the community can see the children running around afford the children better legal protection against harm than childcare centres in less visible locations, let's say rural Australia, you would be concerned and you'd be likely to conclude that something had gone horribly wrong in the policy formation process. The same can be said in the animal case. Around 11 million commercial egg-laying hens live in battery cages in Australia. Here is a legally obtained photo of an Australian battery farm. I have to thank Yvette Watt for the image. But as beautiful as this photo is, in my opinion, it tells us very little about the life of a commercial egg-laying hen. I find it difficult, based on this image, this legally available image, to say whether the housing appears to be appropriate, whether the hens appear to be in good health, whether the cages provide the type of living environment I think is suitable for hens. This image provides me with almost none of the information I need as an Australian citizen in whose name animal welfare policy is formulated to decide whether the current policy settings reflect my values or not. Here is a photo of commercial egg-laying hens in Australia that in all likelihood was obtained illegally. I find this photo much more informative from a public policy perspective. Looking at this photo, I think to myself, it appears the hens don't have adequate space to move. It appears the hens are caged in close confinement. It appears the hens don't have access to grass or sunlight. It appears the hens are unable to make nests. It appears the hens don't have access to fresh food. It appears the hens have suffered from feather loss. Looking at this photo, I think to myself, if these are legally housed birds, then policy in this area doesn't reflect my values and I'd like to see it changed. So how do I know this photo was probably illegally obtained? Because in addition to being private property items to be bought and sold, literally livestock, almost all non-human animals we breed to live alongside us in liberal democracies live on or in private property, where the community is legally obstructed from seeing the animals for themselves. As such, the community is also legally obstructed from formulating their own view about whether the policy we've developed to regulate the lives of animals is fair or not. So where did this image come from? In all likelihood, it was obtained by an animal activist who trespassed into the shed in order to capture the image. In other words, in order to provide the community with some level of insight into how commercial egg-laying hens live, someone had to break the law, and in doing so, risk their own liberty to capture this image for distribution. I put it to you that without people willing to do such things, none of us would have any idea what a battery cage looks like, and that would be the most serious of liberal democratic failings. In work I've undertaken with Claire McCausland and Scott Brenton, I've argued that animal activists who trespass in order to capture images of non-human animals for the explicit purpose of generating policy debate are acting in a manner that's consistent with the best tradition of civil disobedience. Consider the case of Animal Liberation and Pepys ducks. On June 19, 2012, Animal Liberation achieved a media splash when the ABC's 7:30 program ran a story on Pepys. The broadcast included a range of footage, some of which was described as covert and which was clearly filmed illegally by animal liberation supporters or members who had committed trespass into an intensive duck meat shed. The story was framed around the footage obtained via trespass, and the story was titled "Disturbing Footage Prompts Calls for Duck Farming Changes." Now, in addition to running the footage on the 7:30 report, Animal Liberation also put some of the footage up on YouTube, and I'm just going to play a couple of seconds for you so you can get a sense of the kind of thing I'm talking about. In the broadcast, it was very clear, in the 7:30 report broadcast, it was very clear what footage had been obtained via trespass and what footage had been obtained by ABC camera people who went into the sheds and filmed with the owner's permission. And this is the illegally obtained footage. Using the duck footage as a case study, it seems reasonable to conclude that obtaining and disseminating the footage was conscientiously motivated. There's no reason to believe that Animal Liberation profited from the footage in any way, or that the organisation was motivated by anything other than a desire to educate the community about the intensive rearing of ducks, in the hope that community interest would lead to industry reform. The first condition of civil disobedience is that an action be conscientiously motivated. In this case, that condition was met. Animal Liberation chose a popular and well-respected current affairs program through which to air the footage. This suggests they had a sincere desire to see the video widely distributed. That's the second requirement of civil disobedience. Finally, all acts of civil disobedience must be undertaken with a view to changing the law. A personal vendetta against a farmer, for example, would undermine any legitimate claim to a civil disobedience defence. There's no evidence to suggest that Animal Liberation's agenda was anything other than policy-driven. Their policy focus was in all likelihood twofold. At best, they probably hoped to change animal welfare laws to better protect the interests of ducks raised for meat. Failing that, they were probably seeking to change Australian consumer law, which had allowed Pepe's ducks to use the terms open-range ducks and grown nature's way on their packaging, together with an image of a duck located adjacent to a pond in the outdoors. This is despite the fact that Pepe's ducks are reared in sheds without access to open water. So how do we know how these animals that are raised for meat and bred for research live their lives? Well, it's not because we have the capacity to incidentally observe them while we go about our normal business. Instead, animal activists have to risk their liberty to show the community what they would be otherwise incapable of seeing for themselves. While the actions of people who do so, in my view, are defensible with reference to the principle of civil disobedience, they are nonetheless illegal acts, and as such might be unacceptable to some. Now, I was recently expelled from the Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics for arguing that certain types of trespass by animal activists meets the definition of civil disobedience. In the hypersensitive world of animal ethics, some have arrived at the conclusion that the mere discussion of illegal activity must be disavowed. The Oxford Centre for Animal Ethics is not extraordinary in this regard. Other animal groups make lofty claims to strict legal adherence, apparently oblivious to their own reliance on images or information obtained via trespass. And naturally enough, farmers don't want people trespassing onto their property and documenting the conditions in which the animals live. The so-called ag-gag laws attest to this. In the US, a number of jurisdictions have sought to make the act of obtaining employment for the purpose of capturing images of animals in factory farms a criminal offence. The same laws require that any footage obtained by animal activists must be quickly surrendered to law enforcement authorities. rather than distributed via the media. Voices calling for similar laws are starting to be heard in Australia, although I must report that at this stage they're primarily coming from the rural press. But nonetheless, we're left with a puzzle. Liberal democracies carry with them a promise that communities will be engaged in the process of policy making. But how do we formulate policy about something which we're structurally prohibited from knowing anything about? How can we address this lack of transparency and community engagement in this particular aspect of public policy formation? The problem of transparency is difficult to address. I cannot see a situation in which private property relations will break down and interested parties will be able to walk onto anybody's property in order to inspect their animals. There was a time during the early modern period in which many animals lived alongside us in cities. But there's a big cost to having animals in cities, including having to navigate around them, walk through their waste, etc. I can't see any possibility that animals are going to be returned to cities anytime soon. So what's the solution? I propose that people who are interested in protecting the interests of non-human animals seek to engage the fundamental liberal democratic principle of equity and apply the equity principle to the way we create public policy for animals. Of all the things that might be said to define liberal democracies and make them unlike other forms of political organisation, equity lies at the heart. If I were to tell you about different policies in place to protect high visibility children from harm at the expense of low visibility children, as in the childcare example I used earlier, then you'd be right to think that something had gone amiss in our policy making process. And the reason you would find it problematic is that that type of discrimination violates the fundamental liberal democratic principle of equity. If strong protection from harm is good for children in childcare centres located close to main roads, then in all likelihood it will be equally beneficial to children in more out-of-the-way childcare centres. Why would the same principle not apply to animals? I therefore propose that animal advocates focus their energy on realising the promise of equitable treatment in relation to animal welfare policy. And this is a promise that comes with the fact that the policy is formulated within the context of a liberal democracy. The equity principle means that it would be illegitimate to treat an animal in one way when the animal is in one context and in another way when the animal is in another context. It would mean that the same interest protection laws that currently apply to hens pecking around in someone's backyard would have to apply to hens living in battery cages. It would mean that if you can't whip a horse in a paddock, then you cannot do so on the racecourse. And it would mean that if you are prohibited from purposely feeding a toxin to a rabbit in your home, you would not be able to do it in the research laboratory. Engaging the equity principle in relation to public policy formation would mean that animal activists would no longer have to risk their safety and their liberty by trespassing onto private property in order to show us how animals live and die. This would also be a pleasing development from the perspective of the farmers and other groups who support ag-gag style laws. It would mean that the transparency problem would be overcome. The low level of visibility some animals experience would be neither here nor there, because the level of interest protected afforded the most low visible animals would be tied to the level of interest protection afforded the most high visible animals. So long as we can see some animals, the community would be in a position to set animal welfare standards for all animals via the equity principle. Engaging the equity principle would also make our animal welfare laws decidedly more liberal democratic than they currently are. It would also mean that non-human animals would finally share in some of the benefits of a life in a liberal democracy. Liberal democracies have much to offer. Why not let those non-human animals who have joined us on this journey share in some of those benefits too? Thank you.